Off-Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. In this roundtable discussion, I have a conversation with Kosta Koeman about if there should be a big emphasis on neutral buoyancy while conducting a Discover Scuba Dive in a pool, or should it come in the open water course. So today on Off-Gassing, it's going to be a little bit of a different show. I posted a question on ScubaBoard. I'm sure a lot of you listeners out there know ScubaBoard. And if you know a little bit of my brief history, I am an instructor. I haven't been teaching since I moved to Malaysia, and I would like to get back into teaching. So I posted a question on the infamous, wonderful ScubaBoard, and I've gotten a few responses. And today on the show, I have Kosta, who is up in Seattle, and he agreed to come on to have a little bit of a discussion about the post that I put up. And my question that I put on ScubaBoard was, while conducting Discover dives in a pool to introduce people to scuba diving, should there be a big push for neutral buoyancy, or should this come during the open water course? And then I have a little note on the bottom that says, any Discover dives I conduct will be in a pool only, not in open water. So I wanted to open up that conversation just because I feel that Discover Scuba, or at the time I put the post up, I'm not sure, I'm conflicted, that's why I was asking. I put the post up because I was wondering if Discover Scuba Diving should be that first experience of just breathing underwater. Should you add too much to that on top of that? And I wasn't quite sure if what route I should go. So Kosta, if you could introduce yourself and give a little bit of a background of your diving history, and then we can go into the conversation.
All right, my name's Kosta Koeman. I started diving back in 2013. It was actually with my girlfriend at the time. She was a diver, and we wanted to go to Mexico together, and so I got certified so that we could dive together, and I just kept at it. I absolutely love the feeling of weightlessness, just the relaxing aspect of taking slow, deep breaths, and then all the amazing experiences that you can have underwater from seeing such a wide variety of sea life that's, eclipses what you can see above the surface. So that's how I started out. And I trained with a lot of different agencies, and I bounced around. I took a lot of Con Ed courses, and I became an instructor in about, I think 2016. I was diving like crazy. I was doing, about 150 dives per year, and I just really wanted to take things to another level. I would do things differently in hindsight, but I started out as a PADI instructor, and then I moved on to SSI and SDI. I was teaching SSI's program out of a shop, and now I teach SDI as an independent. However, due to other obligations that we may or may not discuss, I am currently inactive, but I am continuing to participate or try to address shortcomings that I see in recreational dive training today.
Awesome. So the question that I posted, the big reason why I was unsure about this, I have not been an instructor very long. I started diving in 2016. I think it was 2016 is when I got my certification. And I became an instructor in 2020. And in the course of that time, in the Discover Scuba Dives that I have taught, I would see two different students come to the pool. I think, there's the type of student that comes to the pool that wants, they know that they want to be a scuba diver. They know they want to get the certification, but they're not sure. They're 90% there. They just want to get that little Discover Scuba Dive to make sure. And most of all of the Discover Scuba Dives I conducted were all in pools. It was not the typical Caribbean, where you go out and they give you 20 minutes in the pool and then they bring you 30, 40, not 40, but 20, 30 meters down in the ocean. Unfortunately, we see it all the time. So all of my Discover Scuba Dives were in a pool, and I would see the two different people where people, they jump into it, they have a lot of fun. And then I would also see people that they're very nervous getting into the water. It took them a long time before they were actually able to get underneath and get comfortable and breathing on the regulator. So my question was, for that type of person that is having just trouble being on the surface, and then when you start adding skills to, having them become neutrally buoyant, it becomes, I felt, and I say I felt, not I feel, that it would be hard to just task load them to do. So I would just say, hey, just sit in the pool, just sit down and get comfortable with breathing underwater. And eventually I've seen people where they get past that point where they're like, I actually like this, I want to continue. So that was my question, because usually a Discover Scuba Dive is it's designed as like the shop that I worked at, it was designed as like maybe a 2-hour max thing. So I feel this way, it's very difficult to try to teach somebody buoyancy, neutral buoyancy, in about 2 hours. So what are your thoughts on that?
I respectfully disagree. Because, buoyancy depth control is one of the most important things in diving. Of course, there's always dealing, what you learn in open water is to deal with minor emergencies, inconveniences, minor problems, like you get a little bit of water in your mask, how do you clear that out, etc. You get a cramp, how do you ask your buddy to help you stretch out your calf and you go on your way, or the worst thing is you run out of gas for whatever reason, you share air and go to the surface. But I posted one time on ScubaBoard about buoyancy, and it is the skill of doing nothing. I'm thinking about like the Seinfeld episode. It's a show about nothing, because all you're doing there is you're just relaxing, just breathing. But to get somebody there, you need to weight them properly. You need to distribute the weight properly so they can just float horizontally. When I first started doing this, I started experimenting back when I was still teaching for PADI. I would just have my students put on their scuba kit, lie at the surface face down, and I would hand them the weights that they would hold where their ditchable weight pockets were. That was when I was teaching students in BCDs. Now I only teach in backplate and wing. And by doing so, their hands were occupied. They couldn't start sculling around. And the fact that I maintained eye contact, I was very confident about that. I said, don't worry about anything. I didn't even put an idea in their mind that this is hard. Students will reach the bar that you set for them. If you set it low, they'll just go achieve that low bar. If you set it up high, if you do things right, they'll achieve that. They don't know otherwise. And so as they would sink on exhale, start to sink, I would then be looking at like, okay, are their feet dropping? Is there, usually people are foot heavy. So then I would start taking some of the weights from them and putting in trim pockets on the back of their BCDs, higher up. And so at some point, they would exhale and then inhale and just be floating in the water column. And we're talking about the shallow end of the pool that's, 4 feet deep or something. It's just chest deep. And they didn't know otherwise. And then I'd grab the next student. And I would always do this. I would first do the float test, starting out the confined water. And then I would have them do the swim test for 200 yards without mask fin and snorkel, just free swimming. And the rate at which students were doing this varied dramatically. So that allowed me just to pretty much one at a time get them properly weighted and then just hang out in the pool, just floating while lying horizontally. And I just remember just like the way my students were looking at me, and it was easy. It was easy, but the problem is people need to make that leap. They think like, oh, buoyancy is so hard. Well, the reason that buoyancy very often is hard is because students are overweighted. Problem number one, because they're placed on the knees. If you place them on the knees, they need to be overweighted. And then they're also foot heavy. So if they stop finning, their feet will drop. But then if they're at very often they're at an angle then, if they're neutrally buoyant, they will go to the surface. They're always slightly negatively buoyant. How often do you see divers that they're finning continuously? It's because their instructor does not establish that baseline of the proper amount of weight and the weight being distributed properly, so they just float in the water. It's actually very easy. And when I get back to teaching and when I open a dive center in the future, my open water courses are open for anybody to watch, including other dive center employees. You know, there's enough business for everybody. We don't need to compete against each other. I'm more than happy to help people out to achieve this, because there are other people who helped me. And it's really, once you cross that threshold, you're like, I wish I was doing this from the start. The problem is people are so entrenched in their thinking, and their egos make them think like, I've been doing this a long time, I'm really good. There isn't any better way to do this because this is how I know it's been done for decades. And unfortunately, the reality is their ego does a real disservice to their students. I actually had a class where I had an assistant, another instructor helping out, who had been teaching for decades. And I gave specific instructions on that I want the students to be hovering all the time. And I broke the class up so that we could have more one-on-one attention with the students. And every time I turned around, I saw my students just kneeling on the ground, floating at the surface. And I was like, what's going on? And I would always signal to them, to hover. And then when my back was turned, the other instructor signaled them, hey, go back on your knees. And none of my students said anything to me. And I really wish they had. It was one I became friends with afterwards. He goes, yeah, we were going nuts. You were telling us to hover. The other guy was pushing us back on our knees, and he said, I've been teaching for decades. Well, he's been teaching poorly for decades. Just because you've been doing something a long time doesn't mean you do it well. I think in that thread on ScubaBoard, I found that link to this 18-year-old instructor, brand new. I mean, he was fresh out, but I know who one of his mentors was, who was a top-notch instructor. And he was doing tri-scuba with students in backplate and wings and neutrally buoyant, and they were doing nice frog kicks. He was backfitting as he watched them. And one of the things people talk about is, how do you maintain control? Well, when a student is on their knees, they can launch themselves up to the surface. If a student is neutrally buoyant and horizontal, they can't push off the bottom with any force. They will go straight forward. They'll go right into you. It's actually easier to maintain control, and it's a lot safer. I assisted one guy in a class where he set up a rope line that everyone held onto. And when he was working with the students, he would brace his leg underneath that rope so that if they bolted, he could grab them. And it's not necessary. It's because they rush too much. As instructors, our first step is to get people comfortable in the water. I do this in my open water classes by doing the freediving skills and doing finning practices on the surface. So like I teach frog kicks by putting students on their backs, and so they get the feeling of how it is to have their upper bodies and their upper thighs straight, that they don't break at the waist. If their knees pop above their surface, they're breaking at the waist. And I'm able to communicate with them, and it makes teaching much easier. We accelerate it. It doesn't take that much time. Then I like the skin diving skills or free diving, whatever you want to call it. You introduced some equalization. You deal with clearing, the snorkel. So going to clearing the regs is not that big of a deal. It's a nice, smaller step in the process. And so I really advocate instructors to really start their class off that way, because then the customers or the students, they're getting comfortable with having these big fins on their feet if they're not comfortable with the water, because not everyone has a lot of experience of swimming, skin diving, snorkeling, whatever you want to call it, as everyone else. And this is a real good way to make the transition to breathing from scuba. You're not overwhelming them as much. Now, doing so with PADI is a violation of standards. In PADI, they introduced this, I think, 1980 or something, and this is why we are in the mess that we're in, is they had their marketing slogan, "We put you on scuba fastest," because everyone else up at that point was focusing on freediving first. And then there was that throughout the attention to buoyancy that existed prior to that move. And so what I tell PADI instructors is, like, you just give them a free diving course before you start the open water. And that's how you circumvent that standards violations. You will do a huge benefit to your students if you ease the transition, because breathing underwater, bubbles are loud, is just there's a lot of stimulus for the new diver. And so you want to take your time and ease them into that transition. And there's other techniques that you can get into. If they're really nervous about going underwater, just have them swim around on the surface, breathing from their reg. Because at any time, they can just lift their head up out of the water. But the main thing is, I can't emphasize enough, is make people comfortable. Because when people are stressed, the ability to learn is seriously degraded. So that's why getting people relaxed, getting them to breathe, nice long yoga breaths is very, very relaxing for them, and that way you accelerate their learning. And so it comes down to, like, neutral buoyancy is no big deal. And I remember an experienced diver went diving with one of my students. He just got certified. Next day he went out diving with some of his friends, and I got a message from him, which I still have somewhere. It was like, "Thanks, it was so great to not have to babysit him. He just was able to dive." And that's the key of teaching neutral buoyancy and trim right off the bat. You don't have students corking, and you don't have them cratering. Because when you are overweighted, you have this extra gas that you need in your wing or your dry suit to compensate. And when you first start diving, you don't have the situational awareness to realize you're going up or you're going down. And so your buoyancy, the buoyancy force, increases at a much higher rate because you have this additional gas expanding in addition to what you need just to be neutral. So as a result, by the time that people realize it, they're not able to dump gas fast enough. Or if they're going down, they crater into the bottom, kicking up the silt because they're not able to add gas fast enough. They don't react fast enough. And it's not their fault. We were like that. I was like that when I was taught overweighted on my knees. So we need to get away from that, you know. And one of the things that I'm proud of is having students who continue on become better divers than me. Like one of my students, after 2 years and 230 dives, so he was diving frequently, he earned a T1 certification with GOE. That's not a class, that's not a participation trophy, that's not, participation card. You earn it, and that is a tough class. He got through GOE fundies, I think he got a recreational pass, he kept working at it, got his tech pass, and then he took T1. I haven't taken T1. I know if I took it right now, I wouldn't pass. And people have asked me, well, doesn't that bother you for a student to do better than you? I'm like, no, that means I got them on a much better path than what I had. A long story short, neutral buoyancy is easy. The instructor just needs to know how to set you up for success. That's it.
I do agree with a lot of the stuff that you're saying because I actually am in the process of crossing over to SDI so I can more personalize my classes, because I do want to teach classes. I do want to teach open water certificate or open water classes in neutral buoyancy. So I'm going to have a big emphasis on neutral buoyancy first. We're going to work on buoyancy. That's the first thing. There's one agency out there, I think UTD, where they'll actually go and they put the student in the water, no BCD, no nothing. They get them breathing. They, slowly start adding equipment, like, okay, we're going to give you some weights, find your neutral buoyancy and weights. But I think that we're kind of, for me, I feel we're getting away from the question as just the Discover Scuba Dive, because in an open water class, yes, we have the time to teach them. They signed up for an open water class. But initially, I'm just speaking about that first, I'm not sure if I even want to try scuba diving. Let's get them in the pool, breathing underwater to see if they like that. And my question is well, yes, if I'm teaching in a class, then we have the time. You committed to the time. I laid out the course. This is what it's going to be. But in a Discover Scuba Dive, isn't that mostly designed to be about a 1 to 2 hour thing? So you have your briefing on the surface, like, look, this is what we're going to do, and then you go into the water. And for me, the Discover Scuba Dive is just like, okay, I'm just showing you that you can breathe underwater, that you're fine. And when you talk about comfort, some people, if they're floating on the surface, they don't have that control of, I can just be still. But when someone has their feet planted on the ground, then they can just dip down and then pop back up. And I'm not trying to I'm not sitting here advocating that we should be teaching on knees. I want to get away from that completely in my open water classes. But that first experience of Discover Scuba Dive, I'm looking at it more of just breathing underwater. And so that's kind of the direction. So I don't know if we're getting away from that.
Let me dial back, but let me explain a few things. So I could, in a class of 6 to 8 people, I think my last class was 6.
Is this an open water class or a Discover Scuba Dive?
Okay. Open water class. To get all the skills, I only needed 5 hours to get through all the skills. And so that's a lot of skills. So I absolutely believe you just want to get through, the confined water 1 skills, which are pretty basic. An hour is more than enough to have them neutrally buoyant and doing it. When they're just floating, when you just tell them just relax, get them relaxed. I mean, doing in the shallow end, being right there has been very successful. And I remember I had a class where the shop managers thought oh boy, some of these people are going to be trouble. They're going to be trouble students. No, they weren't. They were fine. Because, and I remember them, looking at me. I was looking back at them, and I would just be gradually handing them the weights. And so it only took per student, per participant, I guess, if you were going to say like there was just a DSD or Try Scuba, 5-10 minutes to get them that way. And, you could possibly do two students at a time, hand one some weights and then the other, and then just keep feeding them and then distribute the weight if you wanted to increase your throughput. But I believe absolutely a Try Scuba experience in a pool should be neutrally buoyant, and an hour is more than enough. I think you could even get it through the basics in just half an hour, because remember, the ratios are much smaller for DSD and Try Scuba, especially with SDI. Some agencies, I think we'll have to go back and look at the standards. I know that in open water, to do a DSD or Try Scuba with SSI and PADI is 1-4, which I think is dangerous. SDI requires 1-2 in open water, but I'd have to refresh my memory on what they do in the pool. I don't do DSDs here out in Seattle. I've only done it, once with some kids years ago in the pool. But, my approach is the same. Get them neutrally buoyant, have them do the basic skills, have them swim around, have some fun, and just, be close to them, monitor them for stress, monitor their breath cycles, communicate with them with hand signals, ensure that they're communicating with you back, make sure that they're smiling. If somebody has an issue, you get everybody to the surface, because you never leave a participant by themselves underwater, never. Or a student, period, underwater by themselves. You take everybody up to the surface, and then you address whatever it is. But in general, the Try Scuba experience, it's very easy to get them neutrally buoyant. You just have to dial the weight in. I have that in one of my blog posts of how I first started doing that. And so, I haven't seen every student that there is in the world, obviously. My experience is limited, and it's not statistically significant, because it's just I haven't taught that many people. But I have taught people who were not athletic, had no real water experience, and your confidence at an instructor and not making a big deal out of things, like, no, you're just going to do this. This is how we're going to do it. Very calmly. They just do it. And, I talk to different people throughout the world on getting them to teaching to, neutral buoyancy. And it doesn't matter what agency they're under. All I care about is people making that transformation to becoming divers and experiencing the amazing underwater world. And I think DSDs, Try Scubas are excellent opportunities. It's also a great way for people just to go diving without investing in an open water class. We'd rather them invest in an open water class, but it doesn't need to be. So, I would recommend, recording, setting up a camera in the pool and topside, 2 different ones, and use that to help you fine-tune how you approach the classes, and ask people's opinion on that, people whose opinion you value. Video is incredibly powerful. You can't be recording them by yourself, but just set up a tripod, and you don't need a National Geographic quality film, but just kind of see what's going on and figure out how you would do things differently. What did you miss? What did you spend too much time on? What didn't you spend enough time on? Those sorts of things. I absolutely believe that DSD Try Scuba should be done in 1-2 ratios. And, I've seen where participants are being dragged around by the instructor, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think that people should be propelled by themselves, because you need to establish confidence in them. They need to do something. If they're getting dragged around, they feel fully dependent upon their instructor, and that's not good.
No, and I absolutely agree. We've all seen. We've all seen the Discover Scuba Dives where, like I was saying earlier, 20 minutes in the pool and then out in the ocean, and they're basically being, held by the instructor. I've literally seen, an instructor hands out two participants on each arm, and they're just basically going through the water, getting that first experience in. And so I guess I think back on, I'm using a gauge as one of the hardest students I had. Not hardest. That's a not the correct term. But there was a student that I had in the pool. It took her probably the duration of the class just to be able to get her head underwater to breathe. So she didn't like it, to the point where I was just like, we were moving along with the class. I was trying to create a fun experience. I wanted people to move forward. So it was basically just her where she would have her head just in the water, and it took her about 30 minutes or so just to even get comfortable to where she would fully submerge herself underwater. And those are the students that I'm thinking about, because if I was to try to, be like, okay, you're going under, we're going to get you neutrally buoyant right off the bat, she probably would have walked away and never done scuba again. I don't know what she did in the future. I don't know if she ever came back. I hope that she did. It was just a class I taught, and I was like, yeah, please come back, maybe do a couple more Discover Scuba Dives. So that's just the question, because another thing to talk about is when we're doing a Discover Scuba Dive, we're charging a appropriate amount for a 1 to 2 hour. I always say 2, because I give about 30 to 40 minutes on the surface, doing the briefing, and then we go into the water, get them swimming around. But I have seen people to where if they're not comfortable being in the water, and I know there's the argument of if they're not that comfortable being in the water, they shouldn't be on scuba, but I feel that that's a thing that people can overcome. But I have seen people where they're like, oh, I need to be planted, like I need to be standing, or I need to do something before I can get comfortable. And if you just quote unquote, throw them in the deep end of the pool, which I know we're not, and I'm not saying that you should do that, so please don't, take that from what I just said. If you have them walk in and they know that they're planted and they can stand and they can just put their face underwater and then pop back up, that adds a sense of comfort. So, and I hope that I'm not coming across like I'm teaching students on knees, because I'm not. That's when I get back to teaching open water students, I have made a point to myself, or I've made a promise to myself, okay, I'm teaching backplate and wing. I'm teaching skills neutrally buoyant. So therefore, the first thing I'm going to be doing is teaching them neutral buoyancy before we even move on to skills. My thing is with just the Discover Scuba Dive. So you have somebody that's, not quite sure if they want to try scuba diving. Maybe they got roped in by a friend, like, hey, let's go try this weekend. I think this would be a fun thing. I mean, we've all seen it, the couple aspect where it's like the boyfriend wants to do it or the girlfriend wants to do it, and then the other is coming along and they're like, I'm not really sure if I want to be here. To take that person and I guess because I have not been teaching that long. I'm still very relatively new in the whole spectrum of things. So I'm thinking with the Discover Scuba Dive of that like worst case student. I'm like, okay, that's the bar I'm putting up. How can I create this experience to where, in the water you're fine, yeah, it gets comfortable, but it can be overwhelming to some people. That's why I'm trying to figure out, and through that discussion on ScubaBoard, I'm like, I realized that I'm not an expert on everything. I'll be the first to tell you and the last to tell you that I was wrong, and not even wrong. I just wasn't sure. That's why I posted the question in the first place. But it did, after some discussion on there, it did change my way of thinking, looking at the Discover Scuba Dive. But I'm still trying to figure out, because when I'm still trying to come to terms with, okay, are we teaching people in Discover Scuba Dives? Like from some of the hold on, I'm saying this wrong, but some of the responses is people are basically going like, oh, well, when you're teaching open water courses it's like I had to step in and say, well, this isn't an open water course. This is a Discover Scuba Dive. This is a chance for a person to get that experience breathing underwater. So that's why I'm trying to figure out where is that happy medium, because yes, if you sign up for a course, an open water course with me, that's something that I'm going to want to teach you right off the bat is buoyancy. We're going to do all our skills, neutral buoyancy. Speak like you, the video that you posted up on there, I am very curious to know, because we can't ever, the video is very good. The tri-dive, he's teaching students neutral buoyancy. How much time did that take, though, is my question, because in order to get people there, I've seen people where, day one of open water, confined open water, they still didn't have their buoyancy down. And I'm like, okay, I have to work with this student more. But are we going to invest that much time in a Discover Scuba Dive where it's like, okay, I hate to put it in terms like this, but it's like if I'm charging my time, like I can give you 2 hours. This is what you get in 2 hours. And I have seen people not get it in 2 hours. They need maybe that third hour or that fourth or fifth hour. So that's kind of where my question is on the Discover Scuba Dive, where my whole thinking going into it was, I just want to introduce people to breathing underwater. This is the sensation of being underwater, breathing. If you want to progress and move forward and become a scuba diver, let's take an open water class and let's move forward on that. So where is that line of you want to have somebody like, because that's how I'm looking at it, is I just like if I could get them in a bathtub breathing underwater, I think that would be great, because I'm like, okay, now once we go to the pool, this will be very easy for you. But and so that's why I'm just trying to think of like, where's that line of Discover open water class, like how does that make sense?
It does, but one of the things you have to do when you interview your students, so it's a two-way street. I think students need to, or prospective students need to interview their instructors, because there is an important rapport that needs to be established, but you need to gauge them. What is their comfort level in the water? What is their experience? Do they express any fears? And there's nothing wrong with that. One of the things that I tell my students, like, people are all over the map. My best student was this 14-year-old girl that I didn't teach her a thing, but she was a competitive synchronized swimmer. She had no problems being inverted in the water, doing all these things. And I remember when we dropped down to the bottom of the first open water dive, as she just had this huge grin on her face. And one of the more challenging students was actually, he had a real fear of the water, and I didn't know this. And he was like this 280-pound, 6'5" firefighter. This is a guy who breaks through walls, saving people from burning buildings. Yet he had a fear of the water. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so you just need to be cognizant of that. You need to really ask them. So that's one of the things that I learned the hard way, is you really need to talk to people and ask them in a way that you don't make it a big deal. You're like, hey, there's people who like this, it's really important that I know, so that we can just adjust the course for you. So if people have a real fear of the water, that needs to be one-on-one.
No, I agree.
Or one-on-two with their partner, And I think, these courses should be 1 to 2 max anyway, because you have only 2 hands, and that way if there's any sort of issue, you can physically grab both of them and control their ascent to the surface and deal with whatever problems are going on there. And then, it's very easy then to be monitoring, making sure they're not holding their breath. If they're not holding their breath, or if they are holding their breath, stop the ascent until they exhale, because you don't want a lung overexpansion injury as a result, especially because when people who are very nervous, they retain much more gas or much more air in their lungs because they don't fully exhale. They're almost hyperventilating, breathing very, very fast. And so those are the people you really need to make sure that they're exhaling. And I'm talking about a worst case scenario here.
Yes.
If it's someone who's just very nervous, like, you need to then figure out, like, hey, my normal rate is this, but I'd like to work with you for a little bit longer because I think that I really want you to get at a certain step, but with the fact that you have a fear of being underwater, you're very, very nervous about it. I would like to maybe plan on a longer amount, but if you hit it after, let's say, 2 hours, I won't charge you anything extra. But you have to be able to separate that out because not everybody is the same, and you need to adjust accordingly to what their comfort level is and what it takes to get them comfortable. I've seen people just shut down. Passive panic is something that was not addressed well enough, in my opinion, in my IDC. And I think that I've seen passive panic turn into active panic, and it's not fun, Fortunately, nothing happened, but that's why, knowing how to identify people's apprehension, their discomfort, it's a big part of the job.
Yes, and I agree. When we're in a open water class environment, but isn't the Discover Scuba Dive to kind of address that in that portion, to Discover Dive, whatever we want to call it, to get that addressed in there, to say, hey, this person, if they're doing, because there's a lot of people that when they know they want to become an open water diver, they just go ahead and they take the class. They're like, this is something I want to do. Then you have those people that are unsure, and I'm not talking, like I said before, the Caribbean where, you're just on vacation, you're walking by a shop, they rope you into a Discover Scuba Dive. I'm talking about, the person, because I live in Penang, Malaysia. So there's a lot of diving around, an hour flight away from me. But your average person that lives on the mainland here probably, is not, scuba diving is not something that they're thinking about. So if I approach them and say, hey, would you be interested in a Discover Scuba Dive? You could just come. I've approached my coworkers and said, hey, would you guys like to try Discover Scuba Diving? I would like to get back into teaching. This would be a great way. I could introduce you to the underwater world. And a lot of these guys aren't even comfortable swimming. So they're like, oh yeah, they're fearless though. So they're like, we're going to go and try it. We would love to do this. This would be a fun group activity to do. But a lot of them aren't very good at swimming. So for me to get them to be neutrally buoyant in the water, I feel like would take some time. So that my whole thing was, I'm like, no, we're just going to go out here. I know you're unsure of it already. We're just going to go out here. I just want you to feel the sensation of breathing underwater. That's my only goal in this Discover Scuba Dive, is to get you with your head underwater, breathing off of a regulator, looking around, seeing your buddy, and then if you're feeling that you're apprehensive but you still want to move forward, then yeah, let's talk about not specializing, but catering a course to you to move you forward. I would love to do that, because I know once I start teaching again, it'll be 3 students max. Most likely it'll be 2. But I'm going to cap it off at 3, and it's not going to be the 3-day open water course from start to finish. So I keep going back to, well, what should the Discover Scuba Dive be? Should it just be like, okay, I'm breathing underwater, you're breathing underwater, okay, you're comfortable, yes, let's move right into buoyancy. But I guess I'm still thinking of, are you even okay breathing underwater? Because I think that that's the big hurdle to get over. And then if you're like, okay, first thing we're going to do before you even breathe underwater is you're going to be breathing underwater, obviously, but to get you neutrally buoyant when you're still not even comfortable breathing underwater. So that, I guess that my whole thinking process of a Discover Scuba Dive is, let's just get you comfortable breathing underwater, getting past that sensation. Okay, you're comfortable. Now let's move you into neutral buoyancy. Now let's move you into an open water course.
Well, I have a slightly different philosophy with regards to people who don't really know how to swim. I think that's a prerequisite. I think that's a major safety issue because, I have failed people, or I haven't failed them. I have stopped training on people who could not do the 200 yards, where they were just dying. They were trying to grab the side of the water. It's a lot. You can do 300 yards or 300 meters, with mask fins and snorkel, but I think that's too easy. I think they need to be able just to swim normally, because if they were to ever get in an emergency situation where they were separated from the boat, they were caught up in a current, and they don't really know how to swim, they're not comfortable with swimming, they're not comfortable in the water, that's a potentially very dangerous situation. So if someone isn't really comfortable in the water, they don't know really how to swim, I prefer them to come back after taking some swimming lessons, which is not common, unfortunately. But for me, when also, we're getting back to certifying somebody, for me, how they continue to dive is a reflection of me. And for someone who is a tri-scuba participant, with the low bar that's often set for open water, I'm not comfortable sending them off, getting them super excited about scuba when they don't have the prerequisites for their own safety.
Well, don't you think that this is a great way to introduce them to want to become a better swimmer? So, or do you think it's just, because I understand and I completely understand where you're coming from, and I didn't really think of it in that aspect, but I'm thinking of it like, okay, well, this is a way to introduce you to the water world. Like, hey, if you want to take a course, then you have to become a better swimmer, because that is a prerequisite for the class, is you have to be able to swim, you have to be comfortable in the water. Hey, you're not comfortable in the water, let's get you up to par before we move. Because I can't control what everybody does. I know that there's scuba divers out there who can barely swim. They've just, got dragged through their open water course. That's not something that I want to teach. Personalized, I just want to introduce, my biggest goal moving forward is to introduce people to this underwater world. So, hey, you're not a swimmer. This is something that we need to work on. Maybe we can work on that before we get into an open water course. So I've just, and that's a very, very valid point. So, which if they're not great swimmers, so you're saying if they're not great swimmers, they shouldn't even try a Discover Scuba Dive?
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I would say you can do the tri scuba because it's just in a pool. I would not do it in the open water. Absolutely not.
Oh yeah.
If it's in a pool, yes. But then I would emphasize that I hope you enjoyed the time, but before you sign up for an open water class, learn really how to swim, so that when you do, be able to do laps, start doing laps. And, if you can swim 200 yards without just dying, I don't expect them to be an Olympic class swimmer, but I expect them to basically be able to continuously swim for that distance. And it's not that far, but it's still a good distance. And they don't have to be doing, a front stroke, but they need to just continuously be going forward. And I would also warn them, if a place tells you that you don't really have to swim, I said, you don't want to go there.
No, definitely.
That's, they're just taking your money, shuttling along, but you will not have a solid foundation for diving with a shop that has that kind of an attitude. So, but still comes back to, if they have a fear for the water, then you need to deal with that separately. Even if they are, maybe they are very physically fit, and with some basic instruction, it's like, hey, when you kick from your hip, don't be bending your legs, your knees, bending at the knees so much when you swim, and they're able to swim proficiently. But if they're uncomfortable, going under the surface, again, it comes down to taking your time. When I described earlier about how I would weight them, just give them 2 pounds at a time, that was kind of a slow process. I would do that, and so they would make a slow transition from being at the surface, add a little bit of weight, and then eventually they would sink a little bit on exhale, but on inhale they would go back to the surface. And the fact that it would take a few minutes to do this was always a smooth enough transition. Well, is that going to work on everybody? Probably not. But for a number of I would say for a large percentage of people who might be nervous about the water, that slow transition is how I would do that. And at some point, yeah, I'll be making videos of how I'm teaching if I have my students' permission, because some people may not want to be in a video that's being critiqued online. But if they are up to that, I would like to show people as having a education point for other people, and as well as for receiving critique myself, how I can do things better. There's no perfect instructor out there. Everybody can continue to learn and to improve from how you speak to people, how you order things, what skills that you do. I almost forgot because it's been a while since I've taught. I've been inactive for, going on 2 years now. One of the things that I got from another instructor, and this came from his shop that he taught at, is basically these mask and snorkel breathing skills that you do in chest deep water on the surface. And you get people just kind of used to breathing in the water. So there's many ways that you can approach introducing people to things and skills, and like, hey, yeah, you can do this. And some of it, I have it on my blog, but then there's a lot more. Use ScubaBoard it's a good resource. It's a tough place because we have very strong personalities. I'm one of them. I will admit that. But, if you go in there really wanting to learn and get advice and see how you can improve, there's people who will help you out. I mean, there's one person who has probably been my best mentor, and that's Ryan Custareri. He and Landon Lassiter, who owns Deep Six, they have Aki Water Sports in South Florida, in Fort Lauderdale. He's helped me out a lot. I know he's helped out some of my friends with teaching. And so there are people out there that they will help you break it down. And you want to record those conversations with Ryan permission. I should have done that myself because he feeds you so much information. There's a lot of people out there who will help you. So don't be afraid to ask. I mean, I think it's great that you said you want to get back into teaching and you're having these kind of conversations with different people, because we'll all have something that you can take of value, hopefully, but not everything. Not everything that works for me is going to work for you. We're different personalities. We perceive things differently, and, that's okay. You need to always be adjusting to the needs of your student.
I like that.
That's the thing. It's not the military. You always have to be. And so you will have experiences that I don't have. So in some ways, your teaching will be better than mine because of your unique experiences that I haven't had. And just likewise, in other respects, I'll be teaching better than you because I've had experiences that you haven't had. And it doesn't matter by the numbers. Even if I teach, 10,000 people over a number of years, somebody who just became an instructor, they'll be able to teach something better than me. We can't let our egos get in the way, because at the end of the day, our goal is to make people proficient at basic skills and get them to enjoy the underwater world so they keep at it.
I like it. Okay, on that note, I definitely really, really appreciate you coming on, Kosta. Between ScubaBoard and chatting with you, like I said, it definitely kind of changed my outlook on things. I still think I have some things to tweak, and I hope the listeners out there and future students of mine will come back and see what I am doing. Kosta, thank you very, very much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Off-gassing, a scuba podcast.